Live streaming is on. بلا هلا. So can we start?
Yes, Roa.
So as I said before, this is Ghiwa Farroukh from the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. First, let me thank you all for joining this webinar. It is held on a special occasion. It's the 10th anniversary of the pro-democracy Bahrain uprising. The main title of the webinar is on the 10th anniversary of the 14th February movement in Bahrain, what really happened. So from this title, consequently, this webinar will discuss the Bahraini government, how it crushed this movement, the methods of repression, and we will feature the voice of human rights activists and observers to comment on the situation in Bahrain. Before starting, I want to remind speakers that due to time limit, each speaker is scheduled to talk for 7 minutes. So we will start with Asma Darwish. She's the advocacy officer at Bahrain Center for Human Rights. She will be evaluating the situation in Bahrain after 10 years of protests. Hi, Asma.
Hi, Roa. Hi, everyone. Tara, I'm happy we're dressed in red today. Looks good on you. Okay. I'm so happy to be delivering this. Following the popular uprising that happened in Tunisia and Egypt, the protests in Bahrain began on 14th of February 2011. And this date was very symbolic because it marked the 10th anniversary of the referendum that approved the National Action Charter, which set forth commitments to democratic reforms by the ruling family. The demonstrations were non-violent and they were aiming to defy the political suppression and the government's failure to make the promised democratic transition. And from the very beginning, riot police used tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition rounds against pro-democracy demonstrators, causing numerous injuries and deaths. The demonstrations gathered momentum after the Bahraini police killed 2 protesters. And by the evening of 16th February, tens of thousands of young Bahrainis marched to the Pearl Roundabout in Manama, setting up protest tents and camping out overnight. This escalation directly threatened the government that responded brutally as forces stormed the roundabout in the middle of the night and opened fire on protesters. After a month of protests, and on exactly 14th of March 2011, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, dispatched its Peninsula Shield Force to help restore stability in Bahrain. And they actually provided the essential backbone, while the Bahrain Defense Force pursued and arrested thousands of people across the country. A state of national emergency was declared on 15th of March, which lasted until 1st of June of the same year. And that was followed by an organized campaign to quell the protests as the Bahraini government relentlessly pursued all forms of dissent. In the following months and years, the Bahraini government introduced several legal and institutional reforms to implement the BICI recommendations. However, nothing has changed radically, and many of these measures have proved to be ineffective. The authorities continue to severely restrict the rights to freedom of expression, association, peaceful assembly, and also imprisoning peaceful critics. Bahrain's judiciary sentenced political prisoners to death or long prison terms following unfair trials in which forced confessions were used as evidence, while failing to hold senior officials to account for serious human rights violations such as torturing detainees to death. At the beginning of the protests, the Bahraini authorities focused on ending the peaceful movement and suppressing demonstrations. They resorted to force and responded brutally for fear of losing control, adopting different suppressive tactics. After the protests were brought under control, while Bahrain was trying to convince the world that they were carrying out reforms, they pursued dissidents systematically. It is worth mentioning that the 2011 uprising was a response to decades of discriminatory policies and repression of dissidents. While Bahrainis perceived the Arab Spring as an opportunity for democratic reform and obtaining their legitimate rights, the authorities intensified their suppression to maintain the power. The Bahraini government was very keen to prove to the international community its commitment to reform. They were a step forward, but they failed to achieve tangible results in improving the human rights situation. It seemed that the Bahraini government had no real intention for reform. Starting in 2016, the government leveled up its campaign against the opposition, and it dissolved most, if not all, political parties. In January 2017, the Bahraini government executed Abbas al-Sami', Ali Sengais, Sami Mshami', Ali al-Arab, and Ahmed al-Malali. The executions were condemned by the UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings and many international organizations, as their trials lacked due process and their convictions marred by torture allegations. And right now, there are 8 people at risk of execution, along with 10 others on death row in Bahraini prisons. Sheikh Sarrasam, the most prominent Shia cleric in the country, was sentenced to 1 year suspended prison sentence, and his nationality was revoked. Security forces dispersed his supporters using excessive force that resulted in 5 deaths and the arrest of almost 300 persons. Many of them were later convicted for terrorism charges. From 2015, Sheikh Ali Salman, the Secretary General of Al-Wifaq Islamic Society, is in prison, and he was sentenced to life of imprisonment. Another blow to hopes of genuine reform in Bahrain was the suspension of Al-Wasat newspaper, the only independent newspaper in the country. And by shutting down Al-Wasat, Bahrain lost the last and only independent voice in its mainstream media outlets. The government sent a clear message that there is no space for different voices. Over 10 years, many have died on the streets or under torture, lost their freedoms, injured, tortured, and ill-treated. Many families have been separated. Many people have been forced to leave the country and go in exile. Jobs have been lost, studies have been stopped, scholarships have been revoked, lives have been ruined. Arrests have never stopped. Unfair trials have continued. Restriction on freedom of expression and assembly has worsened. Intolerance toward dissent has intensified. These people only wanted a democracy governed by a just law in which everyone is equal without discrimination. The silence of the international community has emboldened the Bahraini government to continue to suppress dissent without being held accountable. The lack of a clear and persistent international stand toward human rights violations in Bahrain has played a role in how things turned out 10 years after the 2011 uprising. The Bahraini people are still struggling to obtain their rights, and the world is yet to speak. Thank you. Rewa, your microphone is off.
Sorry, my bad. Okay, thank you, Asma. So we will continue with Mr. Devin Canny. He is a GCC researcher at Amnesty International. He will be talking about the methods of repression used by the Bahraini authorities 10 years ago. Hello, Mr. Devin.
Hello, thank you, Gewa, and thank you, Asma. Yes, as Goa mentioned, I'm going to review in my remarks some of the scale of repression that happened in 2011 and also describe how that repression has continued and in some ways even escalated since. There will be a bit of overlap with some of Asma's remarks, so apologies in advance for any repetition, but we are, after all coming in our different ways to try and describe the same underlying reality. So in discussing 2011, I'm going to lean pretty heavily on the report of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, or BICI, which Asma also mentioned, which I would regard as pretty authoritative. So just to present some of the numbers that were reached by BICI on the peak day of the demonstrations in 2011, which was the 22nd of February, they estimated that there were from 100,000 to 150,000 people on the streets participating. Now, I mean, that would be a big figure by any metric, but Bahrain's citizen population at the time was only about 586,000. So if you accept the higher end estimate of 150,000 protesters on the streets, that would mean that over a quarter of Bahrain's citizen population directly participated in the uprising of February and March 2011. Of those, thousands were arrested and at least 19 were killed. Of the minimum figure of 19 killed, BICI found that at least 8 of them had been killed in situations involving clearly excessive use of force by the security forces, and even more appallingly, that an additional 5 out of them had died as a result of torture. There's a key thread linking 2011 to today in the fact that among those arrested in 2011, 11 very significant local leaders and civil society figures who had been active in joining and organizing the street protests are still in prison today. They were detained in 2011 and remain in prison till today. This is the group that people refer to locally as Ramuz, which means approximately just the key or leading figures. And these include people like Sheikh Abdul Wahab Hussein, Sheikh Mohammed Habib al-Muqdad, Sheikh Abdul Jalil Radi Mekki al-Muqdad, Hassan Mshaima'a, Abdul Jalil al-Singais, and Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja, among others. You'll note that 3 of those that I mentioned had the title Sheikh, which in Bahrain among the Shia community is generally a religious title, the title of a religious scholar and speaker. And this is in a community that's quite religious overall. So this points to how the arrests of 2011 removed key elements of Shia civil society from active social and political life. And of those, or all of those I mentioned, are serving life sentences. They will be in prison till the day they die, unless the government relents and releases them. And again, that's just for participation in an organization of overwhelmingly nonviolent street protests. The repression has unfortunately continued in the years since, and especially from 2016 on, as Asma also flagged. That year, 2016, Al-Wifaq, which was the largest opposition group participating in parliamentary elections, was dissolved by court order. The following year, 2017, Al-Wasat, which was the sole exclusive independent media outlet working on the ground in the country, was suppressed by the Ministry of Information. Also in the same year, 2017, the Bahraini judiciary outlawed probably the second most significant opposition party, which was Wa'ad, which was also the only political association which was organized specifically and on principle around a non-sectarian platform. And given that we're being hosted by the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, it's of course more than appropriate to note that BCHR has also been outlawed by the government. That's been the case since 2004. They were delicensed by government order that year. following a speech by Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja, who was a key founding figure of BCHR and is also one of the group I mentioned, the Rumuz, detained and imprisoned for life since 2011. So 2004, al-Khawaja gave a speech denouncing the now deceased prime minister, which led to the government retaliating by outlawing the group's existence in the country. BCHR obviously continues to operate, as this conference shows, which is welcome, but it's of course inevitable that being forced to operate legally underground has had a negative impact on the level of documentation and advocacy they can do within the country. And additionally, our figures, of course, it's worth noting that Nabil Rajab, who was another key founding member of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, has spent the better part of the past decade in prison for his human rights work. And I want to flag that all of these institutions I've mentioned, Al-Wifaq, Wa'ad, Al-Wasat, BCHR, all of them had legally registered with the government, and thus they were attempting to work within the state-structured legal and political space to effect change. And yet the government since 2011 has expelled them from lawful political life, which is just a clear indication of how much the space is closed in Bahrain. So it's unfortunately objectively a fact today that Bahrain is more repressive now than it was at the start of this millennium. And you know, on this significant anniversary date, 1 decade after the 2011 uprising, we can all only hope that we won't be forced to say the same thing in another 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's hope so. So we will continue with Tara Ogradi. She's the founder and executive director of Human Rights Sentinels. She will be talking about the impact of state intimidation on civil movement. Hello, Tara.
Good morning to everyone. I'm Tara Rayner O'Grady, and I'm a human rights defender based in Dublin, Ireland, which I hasten to add has been outspoken about Bahrain at the UN and at the European Parliament. Mine is a country which has had its share of crackdown on protests and civil society movements, with an 800-year history of occupation and subjugation at the hands of our closest neighbour and the chief ally of Bahrain, Great Britain, which is fast becoming, and within our lifetime, just England. Indeed, the natives on the island of Bahrain, which is only half the size of County Wicklow here in Ireland, are enslaved to the Al Khalifa regime. In recent days, despite the pandemic and lockdowns, and despite the increased presence of police, there have still been street protests in Bahrain to commemorate the 10th anniversary of what was one of the most vicious attacks against peaceful demonstrators, and a heinous assault on the sensibilities of people around the globe who watched bloody television footage from the streets and inside Salmania Medical Complex in the weeks and months that followed. But the map of the world is being recartographed again this century, which adds to my hope for the Bahraini people to realise their nationhood and achieve their emancipation. While there is a vast amount of cataloguing of records of gross violations of international law and human rights norms, I was requested to bring in a human element to the discussion today. Human. Now, I understand that compassion is not everyone's gift, and that some people need to be presented with things in a way that calls to the ear of the heart to create some open-mindedness, and that some of us have a way with words. Perhaps storytelling is one of the better things that the Irish are known for. They call it the gift of the gab, or the silver tongue. If that is all I can bring to the forum today, then I am glad for it, because creating resonance in someone, making things relevant to them, particularly if it means illuminating the injustice done to others, is a worthy ability, and perhaps proves my empathy in a small way. It always confuses me that there is such a need to re-humanize people. I have heard the most outrageous fairy tale things. Each people has a reputation or slur that reduces them to less than, the othering of people that somehow removes their likeness to us and eventually their humanity, as if we are not one species or race. Human rights aren't something that happens to other people. They are ours, every living one of us. 10 years ago, I was having a life before Bahrain. I was running a relatively successful business with my husband, who had at the time encouraged me to take a degree in University College Dublin. My oldest son had just embarked on what became a successful career in Hollywood, and my two youngest were still toddlers just beginning primary school. I was having a life, not a bored, middle-aged housewife who became a keyboard activist. On the contrary, I was busy. To give some context of my awareness of the media and its value, my grandfather and great-grandfather fought in the Irish Rebellion in 1916 and the subsequent Civil War, so I had a military background and there are medals in the family heirlooms to prove it. But they had worked in printing. Indeed, my great-grandfather had been the compositor or typesetter on the printing machine for the first edition of Bram Stoker's Dracula. They worked on the press for the proclamation of the state, which makes a fascinating read of aspiration for a people at the turn of the last century. So our family have always had a great awareness for the media and the impact of news in print, or however that reached the people. Of all the media in the region at the time of the Middle East Spring, my attention was drawn very deliberately on Twitter to Bahrain by a young woman who reached out to me in desperation because her brother had been taken and was missing for days. Then I noticed a name that would become very dear to me, Nabil Rajab. This man is now such an internationally respected hero. Can I say that the Irishman, Roger Casement, who wrote the first report on human rights on record, would be proud of him and his message for humanity. He inspired my life. I noticed him in Bahrain from over here in Ireland. His story moved me so much that I can safely say that this man's love for his people drove me to strive harder, him and his wife and his followers. He called for dignity, self-determination, and freedom of religion for everyone, not just Shia. He calls for freedom from torture, which he has experienced and thousands of others on the island, Bahrain, black Bahrain, that is so dark that you can't see the sand for the oil. This place where the sun is so hot that it scorches the people, the animals, and the earth, where there are slaves, where people are forced into labor through strong arming of one warlord or another. I wonder when these overlords take their kids to the movies. Do they know that they are the bad guys, the villains? Is that what they tell their children? Dressed as kings, hiding their craven nature beneath crowns, and businessmen or medical experts and benefactors who fund everything from the sciences to sport and private education, while they hunt not only with hawks and horses, but with tear gas and shotguns. They aren't hunting animals. There's nothing to hunt there. As I said, it's half the size of County Wicklow, with a national population of 500,000 natives and 1 million importees or expats. So they hunt the youth, and they pick them out of their beds or off the streets at night, and everything goes black. So Nabil, this is the caliber of man that I know. I was meant to fly to Bahrain to observe the brutality of the crackdowns against street protests, but was diagnosed with breast cancer 3 days before I was due to leave. The Rajabs prayed for me when I had cancer. I'm convinced that heaven heard my friends from all faiths, Christian, Jew, Muslim, and many secular friends who pushed goodwill on my behalf. Nabil was someone who comes from the culture that followed Hussein ibn Ali. There are many Yazids or bad strong men to identify in the world right now, and Nabil Rajab gave me hope. That's a man I would pledge allegiance to as a leader. Our governments are failing us, but dangerous men who are anxious for the welfare and safety of others and ask loudly for human rights to be protected and aspired to. These are my kind of tribe. Later, last year, he was released under terms of house arrest after years in prison for his outspokenness against the war in Yemen. This guy is a North Star. Today, I can take a moment to savor that he is free and that I applaud his courage and his sacrifice, although he still remains under house arrest and is silenced. Unless you're aware of human rights issues, you may not have heard about him. Incidentally, do you know how privileged you are that you do know about human rights, by the way? That you could be helping ease the pain for others and to comfort them because they're either going through it, they've been through it, or they're about to. Watch out for Nabil, guys. He's always going to be at risk.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Tara. Now we will move to the topic of masking suppression. Thank you again, Tara. We will talk about masking suppression with Amirush Najah, the Executive Director of MENA Media Monitoring. Hello, Amirush.
Hello, thank you. I'm experiencing a problem with my camera. Is it okay if I do it without camera? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. It's okay.
Yeah, so I will do it without camera because I have some problem with my camera. So It's okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so my presentation will be about the media coverage of the uprising in Bahrain. I called it a revolution silenced by the media. The revolution itself was not silenced, and but it was really muted and silenced by the media. So in the last 10 years, the Arab world has experienced revolutions, but one has been repressed on the ground and in the media. But before talking about the media coverage, quickly I will record the situation of freedom of expression and the press in Bahrain. According to the Press Freedom Index conducted by RSF, Reporter Without Borders, Bahrain is ranked 169th place in 2020 and 167 in 2019. RSF qualifies Bahrain as a notorious place for jailing many journalists, especially photographers and cameramen. Freedom House describes Bahrain as one of the Middle East's most repressive states, and here the Freedom House points out many points that the government owns all national broadcast media outlets, and private owners of Bahrain's main newspaper have close ties with the state. The press law, which allows the state to imprison journalists for criticizing the king or Islam. The government selectively blocks online content, including opposition websites. Bahrain authorities have refused to renew credentials for several Bahraini journalists and even the foreign media outlets. 6 journalists remained in jail until December 2019, according to CPG. So now, if we talk about the media coverage, when it comes to assess the media coverage of the events that took place in Bahrain, we should first point out that there was a real blackout on the uprising. The RSF and IFEX are aware and are unanimous that this blackout has been exercised on Bahrain, and that was what's going on even now. So this blackout is still going on. This blackout by media on Bahrain has many characteristics. Attempt by the Bahraini government to impose a blackout on information about the demonstration, the closure of opposition media like Al-Wasat, harassment of local journalists and foreign TV news crews, intimidation of Bahraini who talks to the foreign journalists. If you are Bahraini and you gave statements or you have been interviewed by foreign media, you risk and you can go to the jail. The authorities are resorting to all possible means to limit coverage of the protest. Closure of Al-Wasat, as I said, an opposition newspaper founded in 2002. Access of its online version also has been blocked. The military prosecutor general issued a decree. That decree issued in March in 2011, under which the publication of any information about ongoing investigation by the military prosecutor was banned, and national security ground. CNN journalists, you remember that 2 CNN journalists which interviewed Nabil Ragab. Just after the interview, they were detained briefly. I would like to show you quickly an example of a real blackout. The study conducted by MENA Media Monitoring in 2012 by myself. I wanted to know, as Algerian, how the Algerian press is covering the uprising in Bahrain. So I monitored 3 newspapers in Algeria from July 20 to August 5. These 3 newspapers are the most, they have most audience in Algeria. So the result was really surprising that these newspapers gave little coverage to the uprising in Tunisia, in Yemen, in other countries, but almost 0 article about Bahrain. So the blackout, it was really real in the Algerian newspapers. I will show you the later. I will send you these studies. So this three newspaper, Le Soir, Al Khabar, and Al Watan, almost boycotted everything going on at that time in Bahrain. When it comes to the quality of the media coverage, what we can say, it was biased and really inaccurate media coverage. The media has not given sufficient and extensive coverage to the events that have taken place in Bahrain, although some reports also we can say that have been made by foreign media such Reuters, Financial Times, BBC, and Economist. But compared to the attention that this media had given to Tunisia and Egypt, we can say that the coverage devoted to Bahrain remains insignificant. This media coverage, or little media coverage, is often characterized by two aspects. That this coverage focused on the event as part of a sectarian conflict. For example, by myself, when I saw the TV, if I don't search for other alternative news source, I will understand that the conflict is only between Shiite and Sunni. It's sectarian conflict, and it's not about the real reason for this event, such as the aspiration for freedom of expression, democracy, and living in dignity. The second characteristic is that this even the coverage by the national media, this is obvious, linked to the violence and the riots and the uprising that took place in Bahrain to foreign interference from countries such as Iran, Syria, and Britain. As the quantity of this coverage, if we do the experience yesterday or today, as a small Google search, if you type Nabil Ragab, Abdel Hadi Khawaga, or revolution in Bahrain, only news from the organizations such Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, IFX that come up, while the media coverage from the news outlets very low. So if you do today a small research, only 90% of the news coming up are from IFX, Amnesty, Reporter Without Border, and really minimum coverage and the news coming from the international, for example, news. So I think I already talked more than 7 minutes, so I will stop here. I will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amirouche. Thank you. We will continue with Antoine Madeleine, Director of International Advocacy at the International Federation for Human Rights, FIDH. He will be doing a critical review or a critical reading of the international mobilization of human rights in Bahrain. Hello, Antoine.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for, I should say, hosting this discussion today. It's a very symbolic time, and I guess it's an opportunity for us to reflect on all those years and what has happened for the past 10 years when our groups have collectively mobilized to raise the attention of the international community on the human rights crisis in Bahrain, use all possible levers of influence to try and leverage over the Bahraini government for a systemic change. And I should say that if we want to move ahead in the coming month, and we will have to strengthen our collective action, we have to address the context within which we have approached the Bahraini crisis and look at what lessons can be drawn from that. So in 7 minutes, I'll be very short in analyzing these, but this is the perspective that we have through our advocacy that we develop in support of our member organization, the BCHR, at the international level, where FIDH has always been trying to help support local work and bring it to the light of the international community. So very rapidly speaking, the location and context within which Bahrain is and where it is also has played against the resolution of the crisis for three main reasons. Firstly, of course, its geographic position and the geopolitical status in the region, whereby, because of the military bases in the country, there is a gentleman agreement by the world's most important powers to do no harm to local authorities. This is something that we see in other places. Bahrain is critical at this stage to this end. We can see the same about Djibouti for other reasons, but where we see that governments involved in having military bases, and this is the case of the United States and the United Kingdom in the country, will not go as far as to do harm to local authorities, but rather seek solutions with them that may satisfy their public opinion. Secondly, the war in Yemen has quietly overshadowed the criticism that the international community was making on Bahrain. Following the Pearl Square revolt and the subsequent development with the big key recommendations, we as a collective achieved the international community's mobilization and attention to the crisis in Bahrain. However, with the war in Yemen, attention has shifted to a more important or major crisis, which has, in the making, I should say, pushed international and Western powers into supporting further the repression in the country through the conduction and a conclusion of trade agreement, of arms deals agreements with the countries of the region. And Bahrain has also been one of those, being a supporter of that and beneficiary of that cooperation. The third component has also been witnessed at the international level with a global theater of a shrinking space to civil society, whereby when following the aftermath of the Pearl Square revolt, Bahraini civil society had a very significant role and power and voice at the international level, in particular at the Human Rights Council. The growing and silent repression gained access to the international level, leading to major voices being silenced from speaking out at the international level. This is in particular the case of Nabil Rajab, as well as the various Bahraini human rights organizations who couldn't sustain the interaction that they were having with international institutions and had to fall back either in working in silent mode or using organizations to develop and deploy outside of Bahrain. In this context, the response of the authorities to the international's attention has been successful for the authorities. And I should say, if we want to put it in simple words, glossy paper human rights policy works, i.e. the big key's very sophisticated and in-depth investigation into the repression of the Pearl Square succeeded in convincing the international community that there could be an intention of the Bahraini authorities to move forward in the resolution of the crimes. And this has been further supported by window dressing mechanisms that have been set up by the authorities, notably to repress and to prosecute torture and ensure that torture wouldn't be pursued in the country. But we all know that the authors of this repression remaining within the highest ranks of the Bahraini hierarchy, the strategy was in fact in the hands of the Bahraini authorities, who developed a sophisticated window dressing which convinced the international level. And this has worked in a context where the repression moved from the outburst of the Pole Squares revolt to a silent form of repression, whereby on a daily basis, civilian unrest were gradually being repressed and without or even a meager forms of condemnation at the international level, bearing in mind the intergovernmental nature of the Human Rights Council's action, which blocked it in this context. So what are the challenges to move forward on this? The challenges to address this context are in analyzing the effectiveness and the efficiency of the international levels of influence in our hands. Am I short of time to conclude? So I'll try to be brief and summarize what I have to say. In 5 points to move forward. Over the past days, the European Union has concluded a cooperation agreement with Bahrain, which means that the normalization of the relationship with the Bahraini regime works. The first point on which we may pursue our work is the conditionality of this agreement. The next step of this cooperation agreement will be in the hands of the European Parliament, where we can build levers within the context of this cooperation agreement to ask for a very specific roadmap for reforms and concrete reforms and release of political prisoners as conditions for the European Parliament's support to this agreement. The second stage are targeted sanctions. Litigation has developed within the European Union countries to make sure that the authors of torture would be prosecuted. Nevertheless, the universal jurisdiction for crimes of torture is not strong or robust enough to have helped apprehend these authors. The EU's targeted sanction regimes can be used and should be used to transfer the condemnation against these authors of those crimes into individual liability and responsibility mechanisms, individual sanctions that are available now within the European Union for these purposes. Third lever, trade on arms and dual-use weapons has been developing over the years. There are international mechanisms and instruments to control the sale of arms and weapons. This is a process in the beginning and in the development. We hope and we are hopeful that within the coming years, the control over these arms sales and dual-use weapons will become much more stronger, and these are opportunities for further mobilization. Fourthly, the control of corporate social responsibility, the involvement of European corporations into partnering with the Bahraini regime for the purpose of furthering the repression is something that can be further strengthened. The OECD national contact points are only in the beginning of the efficiency of their work. A reform of the NCP contact points should be discussed on this. In parallel, the setting up of EU regulations on corporate social responsibility will help also strengthen the control over European corporations. Which brings me to the last word, and I'm sorry for having so long, which is the role of the multilateral arena in this context, and notably the special procedures, which have always been very vocal in denouncing the abuses of the Bahraini regime. It is fundamental for us to use these expert advice, not only to document the Bahraini regime's failures, but also to address and document the failures of the Western powers' leverages on foreign policy and on human rights policy. Through that coordinated approach of public visibility, expert denunciation, and if possible litigation in these purposes, we believe that these international levels of influence may prove more effective and more efficient to bring about change in Bahrain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antoine. So now we will move to the prominent human rights defender, Mr. Khalid Al-Ibrahim. He's the Executive Director of GCHR, the Gulf Center for Human Rights. He will be talking about the reality of freedoms in Bahrain. Hello, Mr. Khalid.
Thank you, Ghawa. Thank you, Asma. Thank you, PCHR, for organizing such a very important talk about what happened in Bahrain in 2011. So I will talk very quickly. I have a bit lengthy speech. So I go back to 2011. It was one of the first mornings of February 2011 when my colleague, prominent human rights defender Abdel Hadi Al-Khawaja, called me to tell me I have resigned from my job as MENA protection coordinator with Frontline Defenders. I told him, you didn't tell me, Abdel Hadi. You didn't tell me that before. He replied to me, there was no time for that. I want to be with my people in their uprising. This is how human rights defenders in Bahrain were leading the peaceful popular movement. They put all their efforts to make it a peaceful and successful uprising. In addition to Abdel Hadi, you would find there in the Barrel Square a number of other prominent defenders, Nabil Rajab, Naji Fatil, Abdel Jalil Singh, Zainab Al-Khawaja, and many others. It was a mainly peaceful protest movement, took to the streets to demand an elected government and a respect to people's rights before a deadly crackdown. Human rights defenders paid a heavy price after the crackdown. Abdel Hadi Al-Khawaja, after more than 10 years, is still in prison serving a life sentence for his peaceful and legitimate human rights activity, as it is the case with Nadia Fatil, Abdel Jalil Singh, and other activists. As for Nabil, he faced harsh years in prison and was only released in June under 2017 law that allows courts to impose alternative sentence for detainees after they serve more than half of their sentence. It has been really one of the happiest days in the year 2020 to see my colleague Nabil meet his family. We must now focus effort to secure the release of Abdel Hadi and all other detained colleagues. I'm still hopeful about Bahrain. Still, we have a strong human rights movement, and people still have the determination to defend their rights. Yesterday, demonstrations took place in Bahrain despite hefty police presence. On the 10th anniversary of the peaceful popular movement of the Bahraini people, we need to send a united call on the international community to help free human rights defenders in Bahrain, to stop the persecution of journalists simply for peacefully exercising their rights to freedom of expression and assembly, and most importantly, to respect public freedoms, including freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. Bahrain now has a reputation as one of the few countries in which all well-known human rights defenders who are not already in jail or in exile have been banned from working freely for human rights or traveling. This is designed to isolate the human rights movement and cut its links with the international mechanisms, including the UN system. As you know, human rights defenders are not allowed to appear before the UN Human Rights Council, and it is really very, very much risky to appear. We know that Bahrain is well known for reprisals against people who are cooperating with the UN. There are many examples. There is no time to go through them. Human rights defenders in jail or detention were victims of torture and ill treatment. This is very important also to focus on. Let us not forget that our detained colleagues, Abdel Hadi Al-Khawaja, Ibtisam Al-Sayiq, Naji Fatil, journalist Naziha Saeed, and many others were tortured. And I would like to send a strong and a clear message that torture crimes will be resolved no matter how long it takes, and that their perpetrators will inevitably face justice. And in the past year, Abdel Hadi Al-Khawaja and other prisoners of conscience have protested repeatedly about the deteriorating conditions in Joe prison. And we need always to make sure that while they are in prison, the UN standard minimum rules, Nelson Mandela rules, must be implemented all the time. I also have to say that the unconditional support given by US and UK to oppressive governments in the region, including the government of Bahrain, really is one of the main reasons for this deterioration of human rights situation. Also, one of the reasons why our colleagues are still in prison. We have to appeal to the UN various mechanisms. The EU, in addition to all governments with influence, in particular the United Nations, the United States and the United Kingdom, to apply serious pressure on Bahrain to demand the immediate release of all detained human rights defenders as well as all prisoners of conscience, and to protect public freedom, in particular freedom of expression and freedom of assembly and freedom of association. We further have to call on Bahrain authorities to allow the UN special rapporteurs on human rights defenders, freedom of expression and torture to visit Bahrain immediately in order to meet representatives of civil society organizations, to meet detainees, to visit the prisons and to see face-to-face the situation in the country. In addition, we have to call on the government of Bahrain to fulfill its promises made during Bahrain's Universal Periodic Review to uphold international standards protecting the rights to freedom of expression and assembly, including by taking immediate steps to overturn the convictions following unfair trials of demonstrators and human rights defenders, and we mentioned the names. And also, it is very important to guarantee in all circumstances the physical and psychological integrity of all human rights defenders in Bahrain, bring an end to the practice of torture and ill treatment in prison, and also in police station or secret location, and bring perpetrators to justice immediately. Allow human rights defenders to work freely inside Bahrain and to travel abroad and participate in the 3 sessions of the UN Human Rights Council. And also, and that is very important, the country, as you know, it is not accessible. I am waiting my visa for the last 5 years, me and some other colleagues. So it is very important to allow foreign NGOs, journalists and UN representatives to freely visit Bahrain and to meet representatives of civil society organizations and human rights defenders. And again, I have to say that it is very important to end all kind of harassment against journalists and allow them to carry out their work without fear of reprisals. I would like to thank BCHR, our human rights partner, for their work, and we fully support them all the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Khaled, for your important recommendations. I would like to say that it was a pleasure to be part of this webinar. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Let's hope that our work will really improve the situation of human rights in Bahrain. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.